Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today in Vlašim in the Czech Republic, visiting S&B, Cellular and Belot, one of the biggest ammo manufacturers in the world, who has a pretty cool armory of firearms. And we pulled this classic Czech heavy machine gun, a ZB37, out of their armory to film. So the story of this goes back to 1930. It is a project run at the Zbrovka Brno manufacturing facility, and the lead designer is none other than Vaclav Holek. Holek and his two brothers would be responsible for quite a lot of interwar Czech small arms designs. Now, the specific requirement for this one was essentially to create a general purpose machine gun to replace the Schwarzlose in Czech military service, Czechoslovak military service. So this was intended to fill a bunch of different roles, which meant there had to be a couple of different versions of it. Ultimately, there would be an infantry version, which, believe it or not, is what we have here. There would be a fortress mounting version, which was perhaps the most important to the Czech military, and there would be a vehicle-mounted version for primarily armored vehicles. Now, the gun in the original design where this project starts is identified at Zbrovka Brno as the ZB50. So there's a little bit of a confusing element here of the factory designation codes and then the military adopted designation. So the factory starts with the ZB50 and ultimately the final version is the ZB53. But it's adopted as the ZB37, and that 37 does refer to the year of adoption. So anyway, keep that weird distinction in mind. Anyway, the ZB50 is a recoil-operated gun, and it uses an aluminum barrel shroud. So this big whole finned section here is for heat absorption and heat dispersion, and they started off with aluminum and recoil operation. Now the problem was there's going to be a series of cascading problems here. First off, the aluminum isn't durable enough and it can't deal with enough heat. It doesn't hold enough heat and it doesn't radiate it quickly enough to satisfy the needs of the gun. They wanted something, especially for the fortress mounts, that could be capable of significant sustained fire. So they have to go to a steel barrel jacket instead. Well, the problem then is with steel, the barrel becomes quite heavy. I mean, this is really heavy. This whole gun is 42, 43 pounds. The barrel is 16 pounds of that. So like this barrel alone is the equivalent of 2 modern rifles, to put it in perspective. So with steel, the barrel becomes too heavy for the recoil operation to have a high rate of fire. And they do want a high rate of fire specifically for the vehicle-mounted versions. So, okay, this starts some conundrums. We end up with the ZB51, which is an attempt to go to a water-cooled version to change the heat issue. That doesn't really work out. They move to the ZB52, which gets a lot closer to this final version. This becomes a short recoil gas operated gun. That's the big improvement to the 52, is it becomes gas piston operated. And then ultimately they make a few tweaks to the system. It goes from a multi-piece receiver to a single piece receiver, which by the way is a really impressive machining challenge. You'll see this receiver. This whole thing end to end is one continuous machined piece of material. But the ZB53 seems like it meets everyone's requirements. There are 2 different rates of fire built into it. So you've got some, the infantry guns can shoot at a slower rate of fire to conserve ammunition. Guns that are going to be used in an anti-aircraft role can be switched to a higher rate of fire for more effectiveness. There are 2 different barrels that are introduced. This, like I said, is the infantry barrel with these these fins. The Fortress version has a barrel that is essentially this same profile, but without fins. It's just solid. So it's a really, really heavy barrel because it's for guns that are going to be mounted in a fixed position and don't have to move. So in this configuration, it is adopted by the Czechs as the VZ35, and they order about 500 of them. And as the guns start to come into service, this is 1935, as the guns start to come into service, they find some minor problems, some issues, and they make some modifications. And the final version of the gun is this, the ZB37. Now, in the meantime, they're already starting to sell guns for export. So what ends up happening is a lot of the 500 early pattern guns that aren't really, they look the same, but they've got some machining operation changes, some tolerance stacking sort of changes internally. Zbrojovka Brno ends up using a lot of those guns for export contracts. Like if we're going to sell 5 guns to Elbonia, it doesn't really matter if they're up to the final spec and they're completely parts interchangeable with our new production. We'll let the new production stuff go to the Czech military. Anyway, 1937 has the final version of this. The Czech army starts placing more significant orders. They would ultimately have about 5,000 of these in hand by the time World War II starts. And we'll follow and see what happens in World War II in a few minutes. But first, let's take this beast apart. All right, so fundamentally, we have here a belt-fed, short recoil gas piston operated, so it does use a short recoil mechanism as well as a gas piston working together. Tilting bolt, we would call this a heavy machine gun. By standards of the time, it was sort of a general purpose medium machine gun, but it was never made on a bipod style of mount. This was always fitted to a vehicle or in a fortress or on a tripod sort of arrangement. Now, I don't have the tripod today, so we're going to be a little bit ad hoc with some of this, but let's start with markings on it. On the top cover here, we have the designation ZB37 and its serial number. And then the back of the top cover has fire selector markings. Now the selector switch is down there, and we'll get to it in just a moment, but this is full auto, this is semi-automatic, and that sort of null Easter egg there is safe. The selector itself is actually down here under the back of the gun. Remember, this is set up to be fired from a tripod with essentially spade grips. So this selector switch rotates through, that's semi, that's safe, that's full auto, and then that is the trigger itself. The grips can be put in a couple of different positions. This is sort of the standard infantry firing position. Pull this down. I can put it in a horizontal position, better for some applications. And then for storage, they can snap up to keep them out of the way. From this position, by the way, they're not locked in position, you just pull them down. And there's one more control here. We also have the designation and serial number repeated, but this is high rate of fire and slow rate of fire. And it's adjusted by pulling this peg out and rotating this lever into either one of those positions. And this will adjust you from about 500 rounds a minute up to about 700 rounds per minute. There is a notch battle sight here set for 200 meters, and then we can also elevate the sight and adjust it out to all of 2,500 meters. So very long range potential, especially for firing from a big heavy tripod. These were issued with 100 and 200 round metallic belts. No cloth belts made for these. They're distinguishable by having this wire tab on the end. So they look fairly distinctive from most other belts. The one thing that you may confuse these with are Swiss Maxim belts. So you can take a look at this and get an idea for what it. So you can take a look at this and get a feel for what a ZB37 belt is supposed to look like. So this is one of those guns, and the Czechs would go on to use this system more into the 1950s and beyond. But these spade grips are the charging handle. So there's a little spring tab back here. Push that up and you can cycle the spade grips forward. And when you pull them back, they pull the bolt back with them. So now the gun is cocked, and when I press the trigger, it makes a big kerchunk and fires. To open the top cover, we just pull this pin back and the top cover will open. It'll lock in this position. And then you have to pull this little lever right here and you can lift it all the way up. That gives you access to the internals of the gun. Belt feeds in this side, of course, and then the metallic belt segment comes out this side. And in order to close this, you have to press up on this catch again. While we're back here, I can show you how the rate of fire mechanism works, because it's super simple. When this block is in this position, it limits the bolt travel to this far. A short bolt travel is a fast rate of fire. When I lift this up, I'm literally just lifting this block up out of the way. The bolt can now travel under it, and it's going to go back farther, which gives it a slower rate of fire, because it takes more time for the bolt to cycle in and out. So, like, this does have a big buffer spring in it, so when the bolt hits this, it's not just slamming into metal. There is that spring. There's the back end where you can remove the buffer, but that's it. That's all there is to it. And I'm just going to remove this as part of the disassembly process right now. All right, now let's move on to barrel removal. We have a carry handle here that works as a couple things. First off, you can fold it down out of the way when you're shooting. In the upward position, it acts as a carry handle, and in this middle position, it is essentially your barrel removal lever. So we have this plate on top of the barrel that does slide. In order to remove the barrel, I do have to lift the top cover up, and then I bring this lever into the middle position. I can slide it forward. Okay, there we go. And then, there we go, all the way forward, and the barrel lifts up and out of the gun, noting that these two camming surfaces or moving surfaces go under, there we go, they go under these two rails in the front of the receiver. So there's the full barrel. Worth pointing out that you can see it's silver back here. There's actually a sort of reasonable profile barrel inside, and this is just the barrel shroud that adds all of this cooling material to it. So gas block is right there, built into the barrel assembly. Now that we have the barrel off, I can actually take the top cover off completely, which I will do just to get it out of the way. So it has these two hooks. They lock around these two trunnions, and so you can only remove or replace it by putting it all the way under like that, which means if the barrel's in place, the top cover can't come off or go back on. Next up, we can remove the feed tray parts. There's two of them. On this side, we push this little button in, which allows us to pull this guy off. By the way, before I take this side off, this is your feed pawl. So as the bolt goes back and forth, this is going to cycle side to side and pull the belt in. It's spring-loaded here, so it can snap back under a cartridge. I have this big lever on the side. When I lift it up, this feed pawl goes horizontal. And what that does is release the belt. So if you need to remove a partial belt from the gun, you lift this lever up, and then you can just pull the belt out this side. Anyway, with this side off, I can just pull this piece of the feed tray off the gun. So there you can see this sliding. It has a peg on it right there, which is going to sit in this, and as the bolt goes back and forth, this is going to cycle in and out like that. Now at this point, I need to release the mainspring, fire the gun in order to disassemble the rest, and we're going to do that very carefully. So we're going to hold this down. There we go. I'll let that forward, let the spring tension off of it. You can see. We can also see right here, this is the locking surface. So as the piston goes back, this is going to drop down and then move backward. This is very similar to the operating system of the ZB37. Very, very successful light machine gun. When we pull the bolt out, if you're familiar with the ZB37, you'll recognize these parts. Also, worth noting that this whole thing can cycle backwards. So this is the recoil operation part of the system. When it fires, simply the recoil pushes the entire thing, including the barrel and the bolt, all back together. That gives the whole thing a bit of inertia to start with. Then the gas piston up here gets hit by gas through the gas port, and that is going to continue to operate the bolt independently of the barrel and barrel extension. So that is what's going to cycle this all back. But you can see that this whole assembly moves backward less than a centimeter, about a quarter inch. So the next step in disassembly is to take out the mainspring, because I already took out the rate of fire buffer. So this, I just push it forward. It's a pretty tight spring, but it's not that complicated here. Push it forward, lift it out. There's the spring guide, and the recoil spring. Now we can pull all of these parts back, and we put this at, let's see, where is it? It's about halfway back. There we go. And it all lifts out of the action. At that point, I can also just slide that piece out. In here, I have barrel extension, bolt, and gas piston / bolt carrier. So the barrel extension is going to slide off the front. These lugs lock into the barrel right there. There we go, just like that. And then the bolt comes off the bolt carrier just like a ZB26. It's got the same sort of firing mechanism. We have a spring-loaded firing pin inside there. This surface right here acts as the hammer. So this is the unlocked position. The gas piston is going to go forward under spring tension. It's going to force the bolt here up. When it's up, this top surface is going to lock into the barrel extension right there. And when the piston goes all the way forward, the front of this lug hits the firing pin and it protrudes through the bolt face and fires. On the return stroke, as the gas piston is moving backwards, that hook is going to force the bolt to pull down. That unlocks it and allows it to cycle and extract the empty cartridge. This big open slot here, by the way, is so that the empty case has a place to eject. This is a downward ejecting gun. And then our last disassembly element here is to remove the firing grips. There's a notch cut in this grip, so I need to have this not out to the side, but lined up right there. And then this can slide backwards. I'm going to press the trigger to drop the sear, and out it comes. So here is our fire control mechanism. We have a disconnector there, we have the sear there, and then this is the latch that locks this in the back end of the receiver. So when I want to use it to charge the gun, I press up on this, which unlocks it so it can slide forward. The sear will catch under the back of the gas piston right there and pull it backwards. So in full auto mode, it just drops the sear. If I switch it to semi-auto mode, it leaves this disconnector up, and when the bolt goes forward, it's going to reset. So you have a semi-auto only firing mode. And that leaves us with the receiver all stripped, actually almost completely detail stripped, except for the one tripod mounting cross pin. So the two tripod mounts are here and here. This is one machined assembly that was made from a billet of steel. This had to be insanely expensive. There's not that much going on the inside, but there are plenty of features that have to be machined. Like, I can't imagine that this had to be so expensive to make. This is kind of nuts. And this is almost certainly a big part of why it took so long for production to actually spin up and get these guns coming out of the factory in any significant quantity. All right, there's the ZB37 all field stripped for you. This is a ridiculous machine gun. Super cool, super high quality, and super ridiculous. Production is slow to spin up on the ZB37. Like, there's a lot of tooling to set up here. And ultimately, by the time the Germans arrive in 1938, the Czech military has about 700 of these mounted in tanks. They have about 1,400, well, they have 1,464 of them in fortification mounts, and they have about 1,300 infantry guns for a grand total of a bit under 5,000 guns. Now, when the Germans arrived, they saw this and they thought this was quite the usable gun, and in particular, the SS tended to use Czech firearms because the SS was not in, at the beginning of the war, was not in the standard supply chain from the German Wehrmacht, the official military. And so The SS had to contract for its own weapons, and most of the major factories in Germany making the major guns that we would expect the German army to use. Well, those factories all had full order books for the German military, and so for the SS it was a task of finding other factories to make other guns that were serviceable, and a bunch of the factories in Czechoslovakia fit that bill. So this gets adopted into German service as the MG37T. Czechoslovakia in German starts with a T, T-S-C-H, and a bunch of other letters. And it would be used substantially by the German military during World War II. Now, in an interesting, ironic twist here, the British military also used substantial numbers of these guns during World War II, because during this period where Zbrojovka Brno is finalizing the design, they actually sell an export license or a manufacturing license to the British. And so the British make a few tweaks to this gun and adopt it as the Bisa machine gun specifically for use in tanks. There's a whole story on the Bisa. The British would make like 59,000 of these guns over the course of a Mark I, a Mark II, and a Mark III during the war. Those are subjects for a whole separate series of videos, so we won't get into it here. Suffice to say that the British did in fact adopt a Czechoslovakian heavy machine gun in 8mm Mauser that they used during World War II, which is pretty cool. So one of the handful of examples of firearms that were used literally by both sides against each other. In addition, around the same couple of years where this manufacturing license was sold to the British, Zbrojovka Brno also made a surprising number of export sales of the ZB37. They were sold to Iran, they were sold to China, they were sold to Romania, they were sold to half a dozen or more other small, well, countries that made small orders. And ultimately, actually, there were significantly more of these guns sold at export than there were actually delivered to the Czech military. So production did actually restart after World War II. In 1946, another 3,000 of these were ordered and were manufactured, and these would serve in fortresses in Czechoslovakia right up basically to the end of communism, to the late 1980s. So it is a pretty long-lived gun, and that might be simply because it was too obnoxiously heavy for anyone to want to take it out of a fortification once it was in there. But beautifully machined gun. Pretty rare gun in the United States. So I'd like to give a big thanks to S&B for giving me access to theirs to pull out of the armory and show to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.